We're, what, 4 days since the verdict. It is no surprise. Donald Trump and his allies have had a lot to say since the conviction. What has stood out to you the most? Has anything surprised you?
The fact that they like to cite how much money they got from the conviction and...
Okay, that can't possibly surprise you. If you don't think that was completely preordained to line up those donors to manufacture a positive headline, if you don't think that's the case, I got a bridge to sell you, brother.
Well, the second part of that is they obviously like to cite the numbers that work for them, but they don't like to cite the numbers that don't. And the polls that came out in the wake of this conviction have all been bad, and they know it, and they just pretend like it doesn't exist. And I thought there'd be some pushback, and they'd try and spin it. They're not even trying to touch it. And I think that is indicative of how bad they see them. They're not talking about the Reuters Ipsos poll, which there was a headline to pull from that they could have pulled on, which was 90% of Republicans still support Donald Trump. They didn't even touch it. And I think that's indicative of how fearful they are that the country is now against Trump.
Because they know 90% of Republicans are not enough to win him the election. Charles, is there any case the Supreme Court grants Trump his wish, steps in here and annuls this thing?
There's not a universe in the entire multiverse where this happens, Stephanie. Not at all. I don't think that Donald...
You're such a nerd. There's not a universe in the entire multiverse.
Absolutely. I don't think that Donald Trump... this is just an unserious request. It's an unserious remark simply because this is just not the way that government works on any level whatsoever. And so the notion that the Supreme Court would take an interest in and then somehow nullify the verdict that was created in a state trial is just unheard of. So this is going nowhere, and it's going there fast.
But he is going to annul this thing. Can you walk us through how that works, what it looks like? I mean, excuse me, not annul, appeal.
He's going to appeal it, but he's going to appeal it at the state level. He's going to try to find some sort of issue that took place at the trial, whether it's the instructions by the judge, the gag order, something, if not all things, and create an appeal and try to put that before the Court of Appeals so that he can stay off or stave off whatever sentence Judge Marchand ultimately imposes upon him next month, in July, next month.
Yamiche, is it safe to say that this is yet another loyalty test for everyone in Trump's Republican Party, especially those who want to be considered for the VP slot?
It certainly looks that way, especially when you think about the VP contenders. They're lining up to really trumpet and echo the language of Donald Trump, which is saying falsely and wrongly that this was all a conspiracy theory carried out by President Biden, that this is a rigged criminal justice system. It's really interesting, of course, to see Republicans talk about the rule of law, talk about their respect for the justice system and their respect for America, while also, of course, attacking this verdict. And they aren't attacking the jury per se. They are attacking Judge Marchand and saying that it's his instructions that were the reason why this conviction happened. But what's clear here is that the Republican Party, if you're someone who wants to have a political future, at least in this iteration of the Republican Party, it seems as though it behooves you to get behind Donald Trump and to really continue to trumpet his words. I will say it's also interesting, of course, as we talk about the Republicans, to see the president come out tonight, President Biden come out tonight and say, and really just get more and more aggressive with the way that he's talking about this. He had, of course, shied away from talking about this, but just tonight he's saying that Donald Trump looks like somebody who had snapped after the 2020 election and he just can't let it go, and that it's driving him crazy. And that this is also the reason why he's talking about all these conspiracy theories, including, by the way, saying at one point that Biden and Democrats were trying to assassinate him when they were doing the classified documents case down in Florida. So it's really, in some ways, just interesting to see this. It's not surprising to your point, but it is interesting to see you have the President Biden really starting to get forceful on this. And then you have, of course, the Republicans are just falling in line with Donald Trump as per usual.
It's interesting. It's a Monday. It's interesting, but it's distressing when you think of the lies that are getting pushed, or you think about the level of anger and the threats, because they have real consequences, right? We know a week ago, Michael Fanone's mother was swatted. Michael Cohen's family was doxxed after the verdict. How much worse is this environment going to get, Hugo, between now and November? You heard Trump there. I don't think the American people will stand for it. Come on now.
I think it's a real problem, not least because the pattern and practice of how his supporters respond, and we're not even talking about January 6th, we're talking about the last 6 to 12 months of what happens when Trump even makes inflammatory statements about the judges in the case, kind of jurors in the case. All it takes is one person, one supporter to act out in political violence, and then we have this road to a very dangerous and kind of problematic situation. And Trump knows this, and his advisors know this, but they still encourage it because, it placates him, it makes him feel better that he can rail on social media. But they know as well, full well, that all it takes is one person to actually act on that death threat to Judge Chutkan, for instance, in the January 6th.
But it shows that Trump has ultimate loyalty from at least some Americans, and he can say, I didn't give them direct instructions to do so.
Yeah, his argument is, it's a heckler's veto. I can say whatever I want. If someone acts on it, it's not my fault. Mm-hmm. But he knows, and he knew since January 6th, because we have kind of the discussion around January 6th about how he knows if he does something and if he encourages people to go to the Capitol, for instance, they will go to the Capitol. And they will
go to the Capitol. And today they are sitting in jail. Charles, our friend Peter Baker points out that if Trump wins in November, he will have survived 2 impeachments, 4 indictments, civil judgments for sexual abuse and fraud, plus a felony conviction. So how can anyone believe that there would be any meaningful guardrails on Donald Trump this time around?
I think that that's a valuable question, an important one. And I think that the notion of there being no guardrails around Donald Trump is exactly why we have to get engaged right now with respect to the ones that exist within the system, i.e., who are we sending to Congress? Who is going to enforce the notion of checks and balances with respect to what the president tries to do? We already know that the Supreme Court's not going to do it. We have that. It's very clear. They are essentially and effectively in his back pocket. The concern about Project 2025, for example, and all of the things that we have already heard about what Donald Trump and his agenda is going into a potential second term should be an alarm to all of us, because at this point, it doesn't seem that absent the legislature doing something about it, that there are going to be any guardrails. And this is a real concern because the judiciary has told us and shown us in so many different ways that they're not going to be the ones to actually hold the president in check.
Yamiche, while most, and I'm going to say most, Republican Senate candidates were loudly defensive of Trump, we saw their counterparts, Democratic candidates, a lot more muted because they think they're going to need crossover voters to win in November. What do you think of that approach?
It's an interesting approach, and it really just underscores the times that we're living in. I mean, as you go and look at the polls, you see that most independents do believe that this verdict was correct. But it also tells you that there are a lot of candidates out there that are maybe really looking at the American people and looking, frankly, at some of the Republicans that maybe are disgruntled with Donald Trump and saying, well, we should be able to try to just try to convince them to come over to our side almost by any means necessary, which means in that regard, not talking about this verdict, not really sort of challenging the sort of echoing that we're hearing in the Republican Party. But it also tells you that we're living in a time where I think you think of the fact that this is a jury verdict. This is a verdict that in a way that in some ways is operating in our American legal system, that you would imagine that candidates would be able to say, yes, I respect the verdicts. But when you see that it's being muted, it really just tells you, I think, the worry there that speaking out against this verdict and speaking out in a way that sort of makes people uncomfortable, that is possibly going to cost people their races. So it really, I think, just tells us that that's the times that we're living in. And if I could, really quickly, you asked Hugo about sort of, could this get worse in the danger? When you think about Michael Cohen's family getting doxxed, and you think about Michael Fanone's family being swatted, there's also the idea that these jurors, they're out there, I'm sure, very nervous. You think about Stormy Daniels saying that she was intimidated when she was on the stand. I also just want to underscore that when we think about sort of how candidates are talking about this, how both parties are talking about this, there are also 12 people who put their lives on the line, frankly, when you think about sort of the political violence that we've seen in this country, who were brave enough to be part of this trial. I think about them when we think about sort of where this is going next.
Charles, let's talk about a new topic. Hunter Biden's gun charges trial began today in Delaware. Jury seated. This thing's about to roll tomorrow. What do you expect?
It's going to be interesting. The prosecution is basing their case on circumstantial evidence. They don't have the actual evidence of proving that Hunter Biden had actual cocaine. They haven't sent anything to a lab. They have basically indicia of drug paraphernalia. And what their case is based on is basically saying that two things. Number one, you lied about the fact that you were either addicted to or using illegal drugs when you purchased the firearm. That's the first sort of two charges. Then the second one is you were in possession of a firearm around the time that you were either addicted to or using controlled substances. So a lot of their cases based on circumstantial evidence. I don't expect the political circus that we saw here in New York with respect to people showing up and sort of saying that this is somehow Biden controlling the justice system. Obviously, it's not. You have a Trump-appointed prosecutor. So this is not going to be what we saw there, but it is going to be a very interesting case for the government to move forward with. And it should be noted that even as this is a Trump-appointed prosecutor, this is not the type of case that feds typically prosecute absent a violent act to go with it. So you usually don't see these types of cases prosecuted if someone has not done something violent that would have triggered this. So if there's been any political prosecution as compared to what we saw in Manhattan, it's this one.
I realize this sounds incredibly naive, but given what Charles just laid out, right, this is a Trump-appointed prosecutor. President Biden allowed this to happen. Shouldn't this put an end to the argument that Trump and his allies are pushing, that President Biden has his thumb on the justice system, everything is super political? If it was, he would not be allowing his only living son to be sitting for this trial. Shouldn't this, in theory, end that argument?
Or even when the Biden Justice Department went and prosecuted Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat in Congress, a Democrat in the Senate, when it's a 50-50 Senate. I mean, there are so many examples of this Justice Department making objective prosecuting decisions all the way through. And frankly, in the Trump cases, the evidence is so overwhelming that it would be egregious not to prosecute them. So that's the Trump cases. But in this instance, you know, to your point, for the Biden Justice Department to go after the president's son in a criminal matter, and remember, this is not the only case. We also have the tax case
in September.
So there's two cases actually against the president's son. And I think that is indicative of kind of how even-handed this Justice Department has operated.
We are following very big news on immigration. President Biden is expected to sign an executive action tomorrow that will temporarily shut down the border when daily migrant crossings hit 2,500. Daily encounters at the border are currently sitting at around 4,000, which means a shutdown could go into effect immediately. Let's bring in Christina Greer, Fordham University Associate Professor of Political Science, and Tim Miller, host of the Bulwark podcast and former communications director for Republican Jeb Bush. Tim, what do you make of this move, right? It's Trump's tagline that he's going to shut down the border, and now President Biden's actually doing it.
Yeah, I think that he feels a political obligation to do this. Right now, there's a lot of pressure on the border. If you look at the polls, you know, voters are more likely to support Trump on the border, despite his grotesque child separation policy, despite the fact that Trump scuttled the bipartisan border deal earlier this year that was coordinated by the Democrats alongside conservative Republican James Lankford of Oklahoma. So I think Biden feels the need to do something. I think even, objective analysts look at this and say, hey, the asylum system is a little bit out of control. I think it's worth mentioning the border encounters are down, over the last few months, but still, particularly the asylum seekers, those numbers are at a high level, higher than they had been typically in years past. So I think that it's Biden's effort to, address a political vulnerability and I think correctly be able to say, look, I'm trying to solve these problems. Donald Trump is only looking out for himself, and I think that message works for him across a number of issues, and this would be one.
Do you think these efforts are going to change the narrative for him? Because the border has been a vulnerability until just a few months ago.
I think it's probably a little bit too late to really change the narrative in a major way, though I will say I think it's important to do it because, to my last point, I think it can ladder up into a number of issues where this can be one point where Biden says, look, you might not like every specific policy decision I made across these issues. I think that could be a message to center-right voters or to left voters for that matter. But I'm out here trying to solve problems. I'm willing to work with people to my left, to my center right, to try to get things done. You saw it on infrastructure, you saw it on chips, you saw it on guns, and that's what I'm trying to do. Meanwhile, this other guy is a narcissistic psychopath that's only worried about himself and was happy to scuttle bipartisan issues if he thought it helped him politically. I think that's a message that works. I think that's a more likely outcome of this than people actually saying they think he's doing a great job on the border.
Christina, Nikki Haley has now officially endorsed Donald Trump, but with immigration policies like this on the part of President Biden, could he win at least some of those voters?
I think he could, but it boils down to framing, and we know that the Democrats aren't always great at that. And, Joe Biden needs to articulate to weak-leaning Republicans and independents, and even weak-leaning Democrats, that, as Tim said, he's actually doing something. I mean, we know that Donald Trump doesn't understand a topography map and wants to build walls, through rivers, which is not possible. I think this also helps him with Latino voters. We've seen that Latino voters are very concerned and vocal about immigration and undocumented immigration coming from Mexico north. And so that might help him with Latinos in states like Texas and Arizona, where his numbers are slipping.
Tim, let's talk about numbers because, let's wait. I want to stay on this because as you're both talking about Joe Biden and who is going to stick with Joe Biden, I'm thinking about Laura Trump because over the weekend she attacked Larry Hogan, the former Maryland governor who is now running for Senate. His seat is so crucial, right? Republicans need him to win this seat. And you just a moment ago were calling Trump, what was it, a narcissistic psychopath who's focused only on his self-interest? On what planet does it make sense for Laura Trump and Trump himself and Trump allies to go after Larry Hogan? They need him to win.
Well, no. I mean, on the planet where all Donald Trump cares about his own power and having a stranglehold over the party and a belief that if he gets back into the White House, he'll be able to do whatever he wants. He's not interested in doing what Joe Biden's doing and working with the Senate on bipartisan solutions. I mean, Project 2025 is mostly about executive orders that have varying degrees of authoritarian impulses, associated with them. And so I don't think he's worried about his Senate vote count. I think he's worried about dominating the party and demonstrating strength or whatever BS macho stuff he's worried about. And so if there's any dissent within the party, it has to be stamped out. So that's why you see Larry Hogan, who's just defending the rule of law. That's literally all he did was say that we should respect, the rule of law in this country. You see him getting attacked by the RNC in a way that no no insurrectionist, no extremist, no conspiracist was ever criticized by the RNC, during the Ronna McDaniel years.
Shouldn't controlling the Senate, winning the Senate, be a top priority for Donald Trump, Christina?
One would think, but don't forget, Donald Trump had unified government for 2 years and didn't know what to do with it. And so what concerns me is that, as Tim has said, he's really more interested in draconian measures and executive orders. And if we remember, executive orders have been used over time for really beautiful and productive things. The Emancipation Proclamation, integrating the armed forces, forming the Peace Corps. They've also been used to put Japanese, German, and Italian folks in concentration camps all across this country, or internment camps, as we called them. So we know that Donald Trump wants just a unilateral level of power, and so he doesn't care about Hogan. I mean, the fact that we are sitting here talking about Laura Trump as the co-RNC chair and his daughter-in-law, I mean, we're seeing what happens in other nations where people are just propping up family members in seriously leadership positions. But I think, honestly, Larry Hogan saying that he will respect the will of law does help him. It doesn't help him get money from the RNC, but I do think that it helps him with Maryland voters. Maryland is very purple. He's running against an African-American woman, and we know that people twist themselves in knots not to vote for qualified women time and time again. And so I think that helps him with weak-leaning Republicans, independents, and weak-leaning Democrats.